Welcome to Harlow on Healthcare. I'm David Harlow, and I invite you to join me by my virtual hearth as I sit down with healthcare leaders to discuss building the future of healthcare. Today, my guest is Josh Claman, who's the CEO of Rimidi. He has over 25 years of experience leading technology businesses around the world, including working in Dell's European healthcare business and other businesses around the world and around the country. Josh, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So could you tell us a little bit about Rimidi and what you are working on?
Sure. Rimidi really has a mission to blur the lines between in-clinic episodic care and virtual continuous care. And our original motivation for doing that was really around chronic disease management. And, chronic diseases are continuous. People go to work with them, they come home with them. And the physiologic measurements that are required and the drug adherence that's required, and sometimes the behavioral change that's required, is sort of a continuous battle with patients. And we want to motivate their engagement in their own healthcare. And to do that, we found that having this conversation between patients and providers in an ongoing way is just a much more effective approach and a much more satisfying approach to both sides of that equation than the typical traditional healthcare delivery process.
Right. Because, look, life happens outside of the clinician's office, and you're only in the clinician's office a couple times a year, let's say, or maybe once a quarter. So that is really not the way to get the information in either direction, from patient to clinician or clinician to patient. So are we talking about a solution that is more focused on collecting information and sharing it from patient to clinician, or is communication running both ways?
Communication's running both ways. And our platform is really it defies classification in a sense because it overlaps with a few other categories. So we integrate with EHR typically using some standard APIs. So we take data from the EHR that give the clinician a background in a very intuitive format in terms of the screen of what's relevant for their disease state, whether it's diabetes or heart failure or hypertension, et cetera. We then combine that through our platform with ongoing remote monitoring of physiologic status for that patient, whether they're at home, at work, wherever they are. We take their blood pressure, we get their glucose readings, et cetera, we get their weight, et cetera. We overlay on that then a set of algorithms and sort of a layer of the platform, which takes the patient's status and compares it to the latest guidelines. So from that, we can expose gaps in care, whether they're medication gaps in care. For example, a patient might have been on a given therapy for a long time. They've plateaued in their improvement, and they need to be stepped up in terms of therapy. They may have two or more chronic conditions, which require some special guidelines around therapy adjustments. They may be missing laboratory work, lipid panels, A1C screens that inform the clinician on that next move and the patient's progress. But we expose all of that automatically within these two data sets and prompt the clinician to that sort of standard of care. We prompt within that same screen, the patient needs this panel or this laboratory test, or you should consider prescribing this new therapy based on guidelines, et cetera. So we really try to combine an EHR data set, a remote data set to give you kind of a holistic view of that patient, and then really drive toward a standard of care, particularly in primary care, where it's very difficult for clinicians to keep up with all these guidelines. These primary care physicians may see a sprayed ankle and then sinusitis, then diabetes, then hypertension. It's very difficult to keep up with all of that. So we're simply using technology to prompt and help in the care of these patients.
Great. So now as our systems have evolved, both the technical systems, and when you say you're connecting to the EHRs, I imagine that's through an API using FHIR or some sort of connection like that. And then there's also the reimbursement system, right? So we're adding work, if you will, to the day of the primary care physician. I understand you're trying to make it easier, but it is an additional layer of service, if you will. And this keys in, as I understand it, to the RPM reimbursement codes that are relatively new on the scene for physician care, right?
Right. There are really two sides of this. One, we don't want to do anything that complicates the workflow for the doctor or the clinical team. We don't want to add clicks to that workflow. We think they've been victim, frankly, to enough over the last 15 or 20 years. So we actually use a FHIR API, and we're one of the first adopters of FHIR and now one of the leaders of FHIR applications to integrate our platform into the EHR. So we literally steal real estate from the EHR and we show up within that EHR screen, single sign on to the EHR. We think it's a little bit technical, but very important in terms of the day of the clinical team. They don't want to look at two different platforms. Sure. They don't want to have more clicks to that workflow. So it sounds like sort of a perfunctory sort of feature of our platform, but it actually is core and really reflects some of our conviction around that clinical workflow. We do take though the data from the remote devices, and we trigger with our algorithms little interventions that are required to make sure we align with RPM reimbursement codes. So the codes shift and change now and then based on the current health emergency, based on some rethinking and clarification that CMS has brought to the table. But essentially, you need to interact with that patient asynchronously quite often during the month by taking the readings. Those readings automatically come into our platform. Those readings then trigger alerts. So we can scale the clinical team. They don't have to look at each patient every day. Our platform will stratify the patients in terms of which ones they need to interact with. So this, Mr. Jones's glucose is higher than the parameters you've set. Mrs. Johnson's blood pressure is out of the range you were targeting. And we alert those on a patient registry, which we've designed, again, from kind of the intuitive workflow on out to make sure that they don't have to add resource on the clinical side. We can scale their effectiveness and efficiency on the clinical side while giving them a lot more visibility on that holistic status of that patient. So we're very excited about this. And, our solution, we say, is not really the solution. It's the enabler of the solution because it still involves a lot of human touch. And we think that's the best approach going forward as well.
Sure. I mean, we can't rely entirely on technology. I think we sort of went down that rabbit hole for a number of years, figuring that technology was the answer alone, but here we are. And I would tend to agree with your conclusion that we need to have some of each here in order to really.
Yeah, it's interesting that that technology can't do it all, and we have gone down this path of sort of wellness platforms that were fully automated, and patients got alert fatigue. The phone felt like some scolding, parent or spouse saying, do your glucose reading or take your blood pressure. And by the way, you're out of range, and alert after alert. And finally, they would switch the alerts off, and finally, they would stop using the application. And we found that the human touch is really more about motivating behavioral change. So you can scale it, again, with automated alerts and triggered communications. But if Sally from their practice is calling them or texting them through our platform, which we allow through our platform, kind of two-way texting as well, texting them and saying, Sally, you're doing a great job. We've noticed you're doing your readings. We've noticed that your glucose or blood pressure or weight are within the range that we were targeting. Well done. Or, Sally, we haven't seen a reading from you for 2 to 3 days. Sally knows that person within the care team, and they know that I'm doing this, I'm adhering to this practice, but someone's looking at that data, someone's caring about me And I'm enabling them to care about me in a more effective way by doing this. And that alone has become kind of a motivation for them to engage and adhere. And it's also increased their level of what they feel is sort of this connection between themselves and their practice or their clinical team and their adherence to medications, et cetera. So some really interesting data is coming out of what are essentially sort of first experiments in this. Some really, really encouraging data is coming out now in this real world experience.
If you're just tuning in, this is Harlow on Healthcare, coming to you on Healthcare Now Radio. I'm David Harlow, and my guest today is Josh Claman, CEO of Rimidi. Josh, talk about a difficult situation, an unusual situation where we're trying to communicate with patients. As we're speaking, we're in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, and we are all on remote, or most of us are working remotely, including clinical practices working remotely. How has your company, how have your clinicians and their patients worked in this setting? And how do you see this experience as changing that approach for primary care?
Yeah, we've seen a dramatic change, particularly around the speed of adoption of these technologies and these programs. We've been around for a while, and the conversations we'd have with practices or health systems were long ones. I think everyone intuitively got the idea that continuously remotely monitoring and engaging with patients is a great idea. And even 1 or 2 or 3 years ago, you might have heard more future-facing CMOs, et cetera, say, no, this is absolutely the way of the future. But there's a lack of real incentive to go through the sort of the rough and tumble of adopting these technologies and changing your work practices within the systems and engaging with these populations that were more vulnerable. They may have 1 or 2 or 3 chronic conditions. What COVID has done, and it's a silver lining if there is one for this horrible sort of health emergency. It's compressed the adoption of these technologies and this sort of perspective on the need to completely re-engineer how we think about healthcare delivery in the US and in other countries in a much shorter time. So it's become kind of the burning platform. And some people, and I would probably agree, say this has probably compressed adoption timeframes in the market by 5 to 10 years. And I think that is probably accurate. There is a clinical inertia, they call it, within healthcare, that there is a very prudent approach to changes. That's for a reason, right? These changes in therapies, changes in practices impact human lives. But that clinical inertia has sort of driven this cultural inertia as well, where it's just safer not to change. We really actually push against change, even though intuitively, or maybe even the data points toward the value of that change. I think COVID has really shaken up the system and said, listen, we've always known this was good. We've always known this was going to be the way healthcare would be delivered primarily over the next 5, 10, 15 years. Let's just move to it now, because 1, we're losing touch with our vulnerable populations. 2, we need alternative revenue streams, and CMS and the commercial payers are now providing a route to these alternative revenue streams that can fill these financial holes that we're experiencing now because of COVID. So it's a very interesting dynamic, I think, out there. It's a complex puzzle. I feel for these, CMOs and CFOs of health systems and practices, but I think we see the movement in the right direction. And the lovely thing about healthcare is that you can add efficiency, you can reduce cost while you improve patient outcomes. It's one of these strange economic sectors where all that sort of aligns nicely.
So it sounds like some of what you've built is tuned for RPM, and we've sort of in this moment where telehealth of all varieties has been adopted much more broadly. I imagine there'll be a little bit of a rebound as things get back to normal, or into our next normal, as I prefer to say. And part of this has to do with the reimbursement for these sorts of services. And I know RPM is just sort of the latest in a long list of remote care management codes. I mean, we have CCM, we have TCM, and we have RPM. With the experience, I think it's just a few years now that RPM has been on the books. Are practices actually getting reimbursed? Do they get reimbursed through Medicare, Medicaid, commercial payers? Is it working for them? Are they being audited? Are you clued into that end of the business?
Oh, yeah, we are, because although we don't manage reimbursement, our platform reports out reimbursement strips, essentially, that they can then process in their administrative departments for reimbursement. And in fact, a lot of the work we've done on our platform because of COVID has been enhancing that part of our platform, that you can press print or you can export a file that allows you to import it into your administrative platform and go forward from there. And we've allowed some configuration capability that, so as CMS does tweak and change its rules, we can do the same within our platform, which is kind of handy. I would say that I think two major reasons for the lack or the slowness of adoption for RPM before COVID. One was this cynicism around reimbursement. Yeah, they say it, but what are my denial rates going to be? And do I want to be the first one to sort of step in the water? And, again, it was sort of reinforcing the sort of cultural inertia that healthcare has anyway, because of the doubt that that this was going to be smooth sailing. The second reason was the copay for RPM. And remember, for Medicare populations and some of these more vulnerable populations, $10, $20 a month. And this was one of the breaks that we saw put on CCM, where these copays were, not really thought through. And, $20 a month is a lot for some of these people. And is it gas money, or is it copay for this program that's supposed to deliver results over, the midterm? And it's very tough for patients to do that, to sort of do that math when they have their day in and day out stresses in front of them. And I think that under this emergency, health emergency that we're dealing with now, CMS did a very smart thing, and they suspended copay and they clarified some of the reimbursement rules and CPT codes. And we've seen this uptick because of that, and because of these other things I'm talking about, which is just a shortfall financially and losing track of these patients they care about. And so I think a lot of that cynicism around reimbursement has gone away. I think denial rates are very high. I think enrollment in the programs is going well, and attrition from the programs is very low. Now we can talk about some of the technology that enables a lower attrition rate, et cetera.
I'm sorry, Josh, you said denial rates are very high?
No, denial rates are very low.
Very low, okay.
Denial rates are very low, and attrition from these programs, once patients are enrolled in the programs, is very low as well. So once patients are enrolled, they tend to be satisfied with the programs. They feel like they're getting better health care. And we've done some interesting surveys along these lines with patients. And so they stay with the programs. So we hope that CMS does not reverse the suspension of copays once this health emergency is over. And I think that takes an act of legislation, but we hope that Congress will see the light on that, because I think it's incredibly important.
And have commercial payers followed suit? Are they also waiving copays for something like this? Or not?
They are. No, commercial payers have very much fallen in line behind CMS, which I think is usually the case, but it's certainly true here.
So how do you see the benefits being recognized by clinicians, by patients post-pandemic?
Well, see, you made a statement in your previous question about you thought there might be a rebound. I don't think there's going to be. The pattern we see in large physician groups or health systems is one that there'd be a clinical advocate that says, listen, I have this sort of highly vulnerable, high-risk diabetes population, or I have a high-risk group of postpartum hypertensives, or whatever the case is, and I need you now. So we engage with that, usually one clinical, maybe it's a CMO, but usually it's a department head advocate. We sort of enter the engagement with that larger health system or that large physician practice. And then other people look over their shoulder And they're not really thinking about reimbursements. They're thinking about, how do I deliver better patient care? At this point in the conversation, money always drives the end decision. But at this
Yeah.
point, they're thinking about that. So cardiology might look over their shoulder and say, wait a minute, we have a heart failure program, but we're not automated in that way. We haven't integrated in the EHR. We haven't tuned that to be part of our core clinical platform. This is fantastic. We need to use this too. So we see that once we penetrate a group with a very specific use case, it tends to expand from there. So I don't think, unless CMS does something which I think would be very dangerous, like reverse the suspension of copays, I think this is going to continue to expand. And the way I usually sort of frame this is, if you think about healthcare in 5 or 10 years, can you imagine anyone with a chronic illness or maybe post or pre-acute procedure or illness who's not going to be monitored with some sensor technology, with some alerting platform and some set of algorithms on the back end? I don't think you're going to see that at all. I think we're all going to get very much used to being monitored when our clinical team feels there's a need to be monitored. Right now, in beginning of 2021, it's still exceptional. It's still the exception to the rule. In 5 or 10 years, I don't think it's going to be the exception at all. So I think this is going to continue to gain momentum as we go forward.
You suggest to me an interesting question, which is, we're in the early days of this technology, of this approach and this reimbursement. And what we've seen over time with other new technologies as they become more broadly adopted is that the reimbursement tends to go down for certain technically driven codes, right? Do you think that is a risk both for the clinicians and frankly for your operation, that sort of over time, unless there's the next RPM, we're sort of CCM, TCM, RPM, and then what's next? Maybe there's something there. But other than that, if we say, well, to be paid here, you need to spend X minutes reviewing this material and consulting with your patient, over time, as the technology gets better, it'll take less minutes. CMS will pay less. Is that a concern?
I think there's two sides to the equation. I mean, there was an interesting quote right before the holidays in The Economist. The Economist did sort of a survey on this. It's a quote that stuck in my mind because I think it's true, that medicine is going to become data science practiced by clinicians rather than clinicians periodically looking at data. And the two sides of this equation are, one, the sensor technology, which right now is kind of clunky. You give a patient kind of a little plastic box with a cuff, and that's their cellular or Bluetooth connected blood pressure cuff that transmits the data into our platform. Their glucose, home glucose is still kind of clunky and frankly kind of expensive. It's sort of this razor blade model, and the test strips cost a lot of money. And so you're going to see costs go down as sensor technology improves and becomes more sophisticated. I find it very hard to believe that in 5 or so years, you're not going to wear a watch that measures your glucose and your blood pressure, and you're already seeing EKGs being measured through watches and technologies like that.
Right.
And so you're going to have this technology sort of ubiquitous. So what becomes important? It becomes the attraction and collection of this data, and then the meaningful data analytics, predictive analytics imposed on this data, and then presentation in a clinical format for the doctor or the clinical staff. And you're going to have a much broader population, so the numbers will increase dramatically. We believe there's probably 100 million Americans that will be monitored versus 6 or 7 million a day, depending on the research you look at. But the cost of each patient's monitoring will go down because sensor technology will improve, and it will be built into some other devices that you wear and carry with you. So I think those two sides of the equation mean broader population coverage, still economically very feasible, even if CMS sees these trends, it drives down remote monitoring rates or CPT code reimbursement rates. I think it's still going to be a very attractive thing for physicians to get into. I also think the expectation from physicians and practices is going to be, we're going to come to you as a patient if you deliver this level of care. And if you don't deliver this level of care with this level of sophistication and dare I say, sort of elegance, we're simply going to go elsewhere because you look antiquated, you look clunky, you don't look like you care as much. So I think you're going to see a lot of these sort of trends converging over the next few years. And really, the promise is that we will have a very new approach to healthcare delivery in the U.S.
Well, thank you very much. Well, we look forward to the continuing evolution of that model. Thanks for joining me, Josh.
It's been a real pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you.
You have been listening to Harlow on Healthcare. Join us at healthcarenowradio.com. Let's continue the conversation on building the future of healthcare together at #HarlowOnHC. I'm David Harlow, keeping the fire going and holding a seat open for you. Until next time.